walk in the fresh air. So hopefully we're stimulated for this second session. We're going to hear first from Bridget, who will speak for 10 minutes or so. We'll have a brief stop for clarifications. And Caine is going to be winning the prize for the most presentations in one day. He's going to actually be doing 2 presentations, but we'll stop him halfway through after 15 minutes, so there'll be a chance for clarifications. And then again, we'll have an open chance for just everyone's comments and discussion. So over to you, Bridget.
So after all that interesting presentations, I'll be giving the boring part. So just bear with me as I go through a bit of methodology for comparing across the 3 countries where we carried out the school effectiveness survey. Right. So I'll briefly talk about how we developed the cross-country learning metrics for the 3 countries, not including Peru now, in Ethiopia, India, and Vietnam. And so for this, we have to define what quality learning means at different levels of education. And you can, as you can imagine, that is a bit complex because we are talking about upper primary school in Ethiopia and secondary levels in India and Vietnam. But we need to also define meaningful learning as not just acquiring knowledge, but the ability to use this knowledge or apply it to real-life context across the 3 countries. So we have to move a bit further from just curriculum-based tests to something that links to real-life application. And that is where we also talk about 21st century skills, skills that are important for the labor market, and just continuing education as well for these students in our context. So through that, we used a maths test. The maths is quite linked to the curriculum in each of those countries, but also we try to make them relevant for the grades of these students, as well as contextually relevant within those countries. And then we measured functional English, which is not just English as in the curriculum, but something more that is linked to how they apply them in those countries. And we developed this test with EI, an assessment organization in India, and we're able to make sure that they're used within this country and they are contextually relevant. So, but the focus of this, the metrics here is our maths test. And so, like I said before, the maths tests, we did them in a way that are contextually relevant. They have links to the curriculum, but also we made sure that it is the content domains and cognitive domains are relevant for those grades within the countries. So we also made sure that there's a cross-country comparability across the 3 countries. So in the sense that we included some common items across those 3 countries that allow us to link the performance across the 3 countries. But also we have specific one that is for just those countries, which is relevant for them and is relevant for the grade the students are in. And all this allowed us to construct a common scale where we can see how students progress. Like we mentioned before, the tests are designed in a school effectiveness survey where we can measure value added of schools across the 3 countries. So what we ended up with was something that looks like this. At the beginning of the school year, we have wave 1, and at the end of the school year, we have wave 2. And so across that, we had about 9 items that functioned well at the end of the full surveys. But remember that these items were also pre-piloted and piloted in those countries to make sure that before we got to the full surveys, we're able to select the best items out of the pool of items that were developed for the surveys. And so we have this graph that shows where there are linkages across each of those countries and where there are linkages between the 3 countries. So this is what we ended up with. Right. So this is an example of one of the common items in the 3 countries. So we use the IRT, item response theory model, to analyze our test data that take us just beyond the percentage correct or raw scores, but give us an idea of how students' ability impacts on how they answer test scores. So on the y-axis, we have the probability of getting an item correct, and then on the x-axis, we have the student's ability. So as we can see from this graph here, Ethiopia is the red dots, India the blue dots, and Vietnam the green dots. We've been able to split up students' performance into 10 deciles, and we can see where there are overlaps across the 3 countries. So even though the students are in different grades in these countries, we are able to develop some items that fit those 3 countries for maths test. So what we have here is Vietnam students doing much better than the rest of them. At this level of ability, the probability of a student getting the item right is almost 100%. But we can also see that there are some students in Vietnam that have a very low probability of getting the item right. So this begins to show us areas in which we can compare across the 3 countries. And these are some of the characteristics of the item here. The cognitive domain, the content domain, which is comparable across 3 countries in maths. It's basic maths content domains and cognitive domains. And we can also see how students performed on the test in this country. So moving on from that, what we can begin to look at is the distribution of test scores across these 3 countries. And when we place them on a common scale, where we scale the test to a mean of 500 and a standard deviation of 100, we can see where each of those students, so this is for all the items that we developed, including the common items. We can see where students in Ethiopia sit more to the left of the graph, then India somewhere in between the 2 countries, and then Vietnam towards the right-hand side. But that's not just the only thing we can see here. We can also see that there are overlaps. So there are some students within Ethiopia that are performing at the mean of Vietnam's test distribution. So this gives us an idea of how we can compare learning across 3 developing countries, which is something that is not very common today. So from here, I'm going to move on. No, I'm actually passing on to Caine to take the hard parts.
So Bridget's explained how we've created a common scale by having some items which are common across all 3 countries, whilst being still relevant for all the children in all of the countries. And that allows us to make the kind of comparisons that she just showed, which actually was surprising to me, that there is more overlap than you might expect. There are more children who could have had, as it were, the same test score in any one of the 3 countries. Particularly in India, there are children in India ranging from the bottom of the Ethiopian distribution right up to the top of the Vietnam distribution. But there are some children in Ethiopia who are doing as well as average children in Vietnam. So in order to understand more about why that is the case, we need to understand how much students make progress at what stages in their educations. And of course here we just have a snapshot of 1 year during their upper primary school. We have got for Ethiopia and Vietnam an earlier school survey which gives us information about primary school, so we can begin to ask some of the relative questions when the data are linked, which I think Ben, you're planning to do that at some point for Ethiopia, link the data and say where did the gaps emerge and where are they getting either wider or narrower. So which schools are more effective and who goes to those schools and who makes more progress, and who, relative to the intakes, which countries are more effective overall. So this is the same chart that Bridget just presented, but this time shows the 2 rounds of data. So the solid line is the end of the school year test, and the dotted line is the beginning of the school year test. And again, this is surprising to me at first to see that actually there isn't a huge amount of difference in the progress that's made overall between the 3 countries. So yes, it's the case that the Vietnamese children are way ahead of those in India or Ethiopia, but actually how much change there is within 1 year really looks very similar. What you could say is that perhaps the change doesn't occur at exactly the same point in the distribution, so it looks as if the India distribution flattens this way, which means I think that the more able pupils are making more progress in India, and the less able are progressing less than in otherwise. Whereas perhaps that's similar in Vietnam too, and whereas in Ethiopia maybe you could conclude that the graph has shifted equally for everybody. So all countries making similar progress. In fact, numerically, India pupils in India make slightly more progress than in the other two countries, but the difference is not very large. And going back to one of Keith's questions, perhaps it is the case that on these tests that are designed for three countries in common, that if you're in the middle of the test, it's slightly easier for you to make more progress because there are more items that you can get right second time. So those are the measures of progress. And as you can see, the India gap is a little bit wider. But also, if you think about relative to the starting point, the Ethiopian one looks narrower, but dividing the amount of progress made by the starting point, you actually get a similar kind of figure. So the actual relative progress is about the same. And Vietnam, again, similar overall. And then, who are they? So if we have a common scale, we're able not just to put the kids on the same scale, but the schools on the same scale and the progress on the same scale. So it should all be equivalent. And of course, there are a lot of caveats to that, which you all know, but this is pretty much as close as being able to make that kind of assessment as you could get. And in this case, it's for maths. We're then comparing the mean Wave 1 score for the school, so each dot's a school again, compared to the mean progress. So how much improvement did kids make in a particular school compared to where they're starting from? And at first, that looks quite confusing, but there are some patterns in there. I mean, in all three countries, there are schools that are making a lot of progress and schools that are making a lot less. Perhaps the other obvious pattern is that there are a huge amount more schools in India than there are in the other two countries, which is the case because they are just much smaller. But also that there is a huge amount of variation in the effectiveness and in the average score of schools in India. So India is the country that's just got more variation, and the dots are all over the place because some schools are more effective, some are less, some are scoring high, some are scoring low. So it's much more of a lottery, not just in terms of where you're starting from, but in terms of what progress you're going to make. Vietnam, the schools are in general performing much better, and not necessarily, however, making more progress. But perhaps that doesn't matter because they're already 3 or 4 grades ahead. Schools in Ethiopia, again, there's no particular pattern of progress relative to the starting point, and then they're kind of clustered around the same line. So the real story there is that in India, the variation is very wild, actually, in terms of school effectiveness. And then if we try to categorize where the schools are that are making more or less progress, here we're just using these box plots to show the 25th and the 75th percentile of schools in terms of their progress, the pupils' progress within each of those schools. If we compare rural and urban Ethiopia, perhaps not surprisingly, the schools in rural areas on average make less progress. The pupils make less progress. We're not controlling for anything here. There's no conditions attached to the value added. It's just a pure description of the mean level of progress made in the different types of schools. Then we see the Indian private unaided schools, as Rhiannon already mentioned, being much more effective on average, with very few ineffective schools. And schools in the province of Da Nang, which is the wealthiest urban area in Vietnam in this sample, compared to private aided state government tribal welfare schools in India being around average or a bit lower in the case of the private aided schools. And then the other provinces in Vietnam varying, with Phu Yen being high. This is the one that Padmini already mentioned had the high problem-solving skills, which seem to be associated with progress. Of course, there's a lot more we could do with this because these are just descriptive averages, and there are a huge number of schools in here which we can try then to look at their characteristics in relation to their value added. So, however, because we haven't got that far yet, we're not looking at the characteristics of schools, we have got the information on the characteristics of the pupils. Who is it that attends the more effective schools? This is the equity question, isn't it? Because pupils are already disadvantaged, let's say, by living in a rural area or by having parents with less education. Are they then doubly disadvantaged by attending a school that is less effective? Yes, it seems that they are to some extent, but not very strongly. So there's a wealth index for children in Ethiopia that shows the wealthier children here in urban areas are attending schools. In this case, perhaps these are urban schools in Addis Ababa. They are more effective, but the pattern isn't very strong. It's actually quite weak. I mean, you could say that really there isn't a great deal of difference by the children's own level of advantage, what kind of school they attend. We don't see that in India. Now, the confusing part for me, especially thinking about the morning meeting on equity, is this a better pattern than the Indian one? I mean, it is in the sense that if you're going to be randomly allocated to a school, your wealth is not going to be so strongly correlated with the school's effectiveness. But if that's a good thing for equity, then this is a good picture. But it's really not clear that that's the case. So who attends more effective schools in India? I think we've already had some hints of this already, that the children in the wealthier areas, those with the greater wealth index, attending the private unaided schools, are generally making more progress up here. But there are these schools that we are very interested in, the state government schools, where children are making good progress and actually have relatively disadvantaged backgrounds. In fact, the state government schools span every level of effectiveness. But what's perhaps interesting as well on the state government schools is that there aren't any really which have populations of greater than average wealth. So almost universally in this sample, parents or children choose not to go to a state school as soon as they get above the average level of income or the average level of household assets. They go to a private school. Sometimes they make the wrong decision, so it appears here, because they can afford it, they've got up to this level of wealth, but actually that school is adding not very much value compared to some state schools here. So that may be an informational issue. I mean, depending on how reliable these dots are, of course, they don't represent a huge number of students, but if parents had better information about school effectiveness, would they go to these schools? Perhaps not, since they're paying. And in Vietnam, the pattern is perhaps a little bit like Ethiopia. It's not very clear. So again, you could say that this is a more equitable situation. So the schools are clustered along this middle horizontal line. Perhaps the ones in red, the Da Nang schools, are a bit more effective. The schools here in the province of Phu Yen a bit more effective, but the gaps are not very large. So we can see that, in a sense, that could be an indicator of a more equitable distribution. So which are the more effective schools? What we can say so far, they're private schools in India, schools in Da Nang and Vietnam. And even remember, when we're comparing across countries, the children in Vietnam are doing much better, but the schools aren't necessarily adding more value. So is that a confusion? Not necessarily. It probably means that most of the gap between Vietnam and India or Ethiopia already happened long before this survey. I suspect that the gap was really opened between the ages of 5 and 12, and then by the age of 14 or 15, the kids that are in school in India, they're doing okay. The kids that are in school in Ethiopia are making good progress relative to where they started from. So there's no clear relationship in Ethiopia and Vietnam. Whether that's equitable or not, we're not quite sure. India does vary by school type. The more you pay in general, the more value is added. That's pretty much the most sort of neoliberal capitalist kind of system you could imagine in a way, isn't it? You couldn't get much more unequal than that. And then students across the three countries, on average, make comparable progress, but there are huge differences in learning levels. And if you think about the average progress being about 30 points in a year, and the gap between, let's say, Ethiopia's average and Vietnam's average being about 150 points, it's about 5 years effectively of schooling, isn't it? So that's not something that you could ever catch up without tremendously effective schools that were sort of off the scale of all our charts. Okay. So this is clarification of them, the next bit, yeah. Any questions at this point? Yes, still awake after all these graphs.
Yeah, I just want to ask, I didn't start very well, so I don't know what grades you covered.
The grades.
My name is Nuruddin Lawal, IFHI 360. That is, I'm asking what grades did you cover? Because there could be variation in emphasis on grades in terms of funding by government, and that brings to mind the Indian difference. For example, there could be less funding for basic education, and then they fund the higher level education. And so parents don't send children to that, but when they get to the higher level, they all move children out of the basic level and take them to the government school.
Right.
And so those...
No, that's a very valid point. So we're, for various reasons, partly because of when they were born and whether they're in the younger lives cohort, the younger cohort or not, we're going to grade 7 and 8 in Ethiopia, grade 9 in India, and grade 10 in Vietnam. And there are different points in the education system. So it's the end of upper primary school in Ethiopia. It's the last year, penultimate year in India. So if you're saying, and it's possible that that in India people might invest, the government and parents might invest particularly in a year where there was exams, for example, in order to cross a particular threshold. Let's say tutoring in private school in order to pass an exam to get to a selective state school. All these things are perfectly possible. But are you suggesting that it would damage the comparison between the countries or something else?
I'm more interested as being responsible for the kind of results that comes out in terms of the public schools doing relatively better.
I see. So it's specific to India, yeah.
Yeah, specific to India.
Any idea on that question? It's quite a hard one.
Why don't you think about it?
Let's think about that one, yeah. Yes, Sally.
I just wondered on your sorry, Sally Thomas, University of Bristol. I just wondered on your plots, just for clarification, you said at one point it might not be many students representing. So right. I just wondered if you could give us some idea of the range of students represented in each school. I think I heard earlier that you've got the Young Lives cohort, but you've also got all the other students
That's right.
in the year group as well. But I guess some of the schools might be small.
I think that only really applies in India. So Vietnam, the schools are very large, actually, and in Ethiopia, they're generally quite large. But there are some. What's the smallest in India?
So when we did the India sample, we excluded any schools that had fewer than 20 children enrolled in that grade. But obviously what this is looking at is schools where children were present in wave 1 and wave 2. So we do have some schools where there are less than 20 in that grade. I think when we've done some of the analysis, although not for this, we've excluded schools with fewer than 15, I think, because we didn't really feel like it was quite possible to look at school effectiveness with less than 15
Yeah, I mean, I think where you draw that line would be a kind of technical question. You could put confidence intervals around these.
I mean, I would say that it would be much easier for people to see the reality of the differences if you did put confidence intervals on them.
Which we have done that in other plots with the kind of caterpillar chart. Yeah. But the lines and the dots kind of makes it up a big mush. Yeah.
A caterpillar one you can do.
Yes. Yeah, it's separately for the 3 countries, I think. Yeah.
Hi, Lydia Marshall from NatSen Social Research. You mentioned that the schools in the different countries, their effectiveness is fairly comparable for the children that stay in school. And I was wondering whether you take in any account of how many children drop out from the baseline in the different countries.
Right, that is also a good question. So at this level, in all 3 countries, the dropout within the school year is relatively low, but we do have, in Ethiopia, the largest number that either have dropped out or have moved schools or can't be traced. Jack, can you remember what proportion that is?
Of the household sample or generally? Generally,
of the school sample, the ones who started and then who couldn't be found 9 months later.
Ah, okay, so the dropout within 1 year is about 10-15%. So throughout that year, we've lost 1 in 10 kids. But in terms of its relation to the population of kids who could be at school in grade 7 or 8, by this point in Ethiopia, you've only got somewhere between 55 and 60% of children still enrolled in school.
Are you thinking, though, that could bias, sort of make us over-represent the progress of schools where there are lots of children have dropped out? A bit like the story that was in the news about the sixth form college that was kicking out all of the kids who didn't do well. Yes, right. Yeah, yes, it's possible.
I'm just wondering whether, when tracing the Young Lives children who were in secondary school, whether you found in India that the children had dispersed more widely to a greater range of schools than was the case in Ethiopia and Vietnam. My impression is that in Vietnam and Ethiopia, children are more likely to be moving together more or less with their age cohort. I mean, of course, there is variation, but that in India, children are choosing at secondary level to go to a whole variety of different schools and are breaking away from the cohort that they entered with in primary 1. Is that the case, and does it in any way affect the way in which we should think about school or teacher effectiveness?
Brianna might have something to add. I mean, it makes it harder to calculate school and teacher effectiveness if you have those issues. But I think that in Vietnam what's happening generally is that more and more concentration. So as the kids get older, they go together into bigger and bigger schools. I mean, so some of the schools here in Vietnam had, what was the maximum number of parallel classes? Can you remember?
40.
How many?
40 classes.
40 parallel classes. Yeah, I mean, vast, absolutely vast schools that children are being concentrated into. Whereas in India, they're getting in smaller and smaller schools.
Yeah, it definitely was the case.
Not in Bihar.
Well, depends where, yes.
Yes, that was the case. So it actually affected how we drew the sample for the India survey compared to the other countries. So our India school sample includes many fewer young lives children because they'd scattered amongst, I think there were about, of the 1,600 younger cohort children who were in the grades we were interested in looking at, they were across something like 500 schools. And also the sheer number of the schools within the site. So within the 20 sites we went to, I think there were around 800 schools to choose from. So whereas in Ethiopia and Vietnam, they just took all of the secondary schools in the sites, we had to do a random sample within the Young Life sites in India. So yeah, it had a really big effect on what we did.
Okay, so the last section we're going to cover in relation to this scale is trying to put some meat onto the bones of what it is children can actually do, which I think again relates to your earlier point. So we've got an interval scale with a mean of 500 and a standard deviation of 100, but what does that actually mean? It's very useful for comparing in terms of normative, in terms of levels which are directly comparable, but what does it mean in terms of either the curriculum or something which can be directly compared? So we haven't started here with the curriculum because the curricula are different across the three countries, and we started with what are common because of the items that were administered separately in the three countries and which represent similar skills. And so there we've turned the distributions that you've just seen upside down or sideways so that you can then imagine 4 levels of proficiency and some children in between those 4 levels of proficiency, which is a similar approach to that used in TIMSS. So level 1, which is typical in Ethiopia, so this represents the average pupil in Ethiopia, is below basic in maths. Okay, so this is what you would expect in this sample, 14 to 15-year-olds in Ethiopia, to be able to do. And this is picked out by a number of items that have been selected for this level. So to demonstrate knowledge of number systems, complete basic operations on numbers, such things as place value, addition or subtraction, and show an elementary understanding of geometry, concepts of volume, relations between shapes. Not necessarily to be able to calculate those things, but to know what they are. So as you can see, again, that represents in Vietnam only the very weakest people, who we definitely could call the tail there, Andrew, I think, couldn't we? And then the next level, level 2, which is basic, which is much more the average level in India. And so it's above what children in Ethiopia can do, but below what the average pupil in Vietnam can do. At this level, we've moved to applying knowledge of number systems, measurement and proportions in less familiar situations, solving geometric problems, 2 and 3-dimensional shapes, and demonstrating emergent understanding of algebra. So that's kind of not just the center of the distribution in India, but that's probably the middle of the 3 countries when taken together. And then level 3, the proficient level, which is just above the average in Vietnam. And I imagine this is quite similar to what you'd have in the PISA average. Students then can apply knowledge of more complex mathematical concepts in geometry, such as supplementary and alternate angles. They can show procedural knowledge related to algebraic expressions, interpret bar graphs and histograms, or demonstrate emerging ability to solve real-world and multiple problems. I mean, this is much more sophisticated in maths, and it's much higher than most children in Ethiopia and Vietnam. The very last level, which we were able to assess, was advanced, and this is for, I should say, about 15 or 20% of kids in Vietnam, with very few in the other 2 countries. And at this level, the advanced level is to solve real-world problems using algebra, advanced geometry, and demonstrate knowledge of advanced algebraic expressions such as polynomials. I mean, that's only you, Ricardo. So the final point about what we can do with this is that we need to have both a normative scale and a criterion reference scale, so that we can link where it is that children are relative to each other, where it is that they are relative to the other countries and the country that they're in, but also to be able to understand what that actually means in terms of something meaningful and in terms of what a country is particularly trying to achieve in terms of the curriculum. And this relates then to these more policy-oriented questions that Young Lives can shed a lot of light on, which are questions being asked more generally and by RISE, for example. Is it the overambitious curriculum which is either the cause or the effect of low learning levels? Is it that children are being presented with stuff that they can't do, either because the curriculum itself is just wildly ambitious or because they haven't been adequately prepared in previous school years to what they're being presented with now? That mismatch between the actual abilities of pupils and what they're being asked to do is something that theoretically could be then calibrated using this same scale. So here's what we know children can do at this level, here's what they're being asked to do, or vice versa. So that's, I think, a useful development of this kind of work that we can do next. Second, the question that's been worrying us so much this morning about what's more equitable and what's less equitable. Is it better to have more equality, less equality, more fair equality or more fair inequality? What are the implications of different positions and different differential learning levels within countries and schools? And I think Jack's two slides, which I'm still confused about, whether, for example, one of them is more equitable than the other. Is it the steep line? Do you want the kids progressing at the top more than at the bottom? Do you want everybody being equalized, which actually could be effectively pulling everybody down? Those are decisions that countries have to make, and they really are problems. And then finally, to look at progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals, which clearly are thinking about having some kinds of common levels of attainment, which can be read across countries, and that's very difficult. We are doing some of that here to look at what's required to calibrate common levels of attainment across country with different curricula. How do you do that? And then how do you link that to an international agenda of what countries should be doing to move from the stage they are at now to the ultimate destination of reaching what we could call minimum learning levels? Okay, thank you. I've still got time left.
So rather than doing clarification, is there any immediate
Do we have any immediate? Yeah.
Otherwise, we can go into discussion. I'll just give a few opening points and then so one immediate clarification.
Thank you. I'm Lars Malmberg from the Department of Education. I was here at Oxford. I was curious when you said you also had some measure of teachers' pedagogical knowledge in mathematics. And is there any situation where the teacher's own knowledge is so low that they're not able to enhance the knowledge of the children in the low-performing context?
Yeah, so we do have a measure of teacher pedagogical content knowledge, which is a combination of maths knowledge and ability to communicate that. So it tends to look at questions which relate to children's common mistakes and how a teacher would understand those mistakes. So can the teacher correct the pupil's mistakes? We haven't, in this case, we haven't used that data yet in relation to the children's data, so I can't answer the specific question, but we did something similar with the primary school data, and there certainly are some teachers whose own knowledge would be not sufficient to deliver the curriculum. I suspect that's likely to be even more the case at secondary school level, but not in Vietnam, which is why we didn't administer that item in Vietnam, but I suspect in India and Ethiopia we will find teachers like that.
We have started looking at it
Okay.
for India, but only some initial analysis, and it does look like there is some kind of correlation between teacher performance on the TPK test and student maths scores. But we need to look at it in more detail because it becomes quite complicated, particularly in India, because as we've seen, the private school children tend to be doing better, but actually the private school teachers look like they're performing slightly less well on the TPK test. So it produces some quite interesting patterns.
We found the same at the primary level.
So you need a mic.
Jack, do you want to bring that to Rand? It's a funny paradox, isn't it?
So actually, we found we'd run a primary school survey in India, and we found exactly that actually we ran a PCK test for teachers, and the teachers in government schools were better professionally qualified. They did better on the test. But when we looked at what was happening within the classroom, it's not what the teacher knows, but what the teacher does. And apparently, that's what was affecting the children's scores. So let's see what that comes out of the secondary school survey.
So maybe if I just give a few opening comments and then again be thinking about your comments, I'm sure there are many. I first of all just wanted to say what a wonderful resource this is. One of the other wonderful things about Young Lives is that they both do this great analysis themselves, but will also be opening up the data for others to use. And I think there are many PhDs here, so for those of you who might be in that position or know of people who are going to be in that position, it's I think worth thinking about. Because it just raises so many questions which are sort of beyond the scope of what you're initially able to do. One of the points that sort of came up, I think, both in what you were discussing earlier as well as now, when you were showing the quadrant graph and thinking about the schools in the top right quadrant, which are, I guess, the sort of positive win-win ones, positive ones. It'd be really interesting to delve into those. In particular, one of the thoughts I had for India, where there are government schools in that situation. I don't know whether you have a large enough sample size. If you do, there's just so much negative discussion about government schools, about poor performing schools, etc. So the more that we can actually identify where things are working and why they're working, I think will just help us move forward in the policy debates beyond teachers are absent, things are bad, etc. So I think that would be really good to hear more about. The other thing that I think is going to really help from the analysis that you're doing, and not just the analysis, but the methodology and the methods that you've used in terms of the wider policy debates, is the fact that you have focused on the sort of older children at the sort of cusp of upper primary to lower secondary. Now, there aren't many, of course, within countries there might be tests that are being done, but in the sort of wider global policy debates, there's very little that people can draw on at the moment to say how we should go about doing these tests. So I think actually even a policy brief or something that identifies a bit more about how you went about the tests, designing them in the way that you were describing earlier, what some of the things are, the way that you've made them comparable in the way, Caine, that you were saying, and some of the challenges and implications of that. So I don't know how many people in the room know the DFID Girls Education Challenge, and or how many people might be involved in it. I'm looking at Lewis, who I guess an RTI, who is, I guess, involved in some of the design of the learning assessments. Is that right? No? Okay, I won't. So as I understand it... No, okay. I scrapped that from the live stream. But DFID, not DFID, but the Girls' Education Challenge, which is funded by DFID. The Girls' Education Challenge, funded by DFID, run by PwC. The point is that they are now working with older children at this transition point, and one of the questions is, how do they design the learning assessment? So for the previous round of the Girls' Education Challenge, they drew quite heavily on EGRA and EGMA, but of course that can't be used in the same way for these older children. So I think just sort of actually documenting some of that learning, I think, would be really helpful. One thing, sort of as perhaps a caveat to that, the point that was being made about what grades they're at and what ages they are, I guess they're not totally overlapping. So some of those things that you're seeing at perhaps different stages of the graphs that you're showing where the distributions are, to what extent that is because they're not quite at the same stage in their education experience. I'll leave you to come back to that later, but maybe that's just my lack of clarity on the point. I think the other thing that hopefully when you're further developing the analysis, point that's come up a few times and Sally made earlier, was about the role of teachers in all of this. So again, we often hear a lot of negative things about teachers not making any difference. To what extent do we see that where there is this positive difference? Is it to do with what types of teacher attributes is it related to? Because a lot of the time we're just hearing that they're absent and so on, but I'm sure there's a lot more variation, and I think one of the strengths of what you're showing is that variation and trying to understand the reasons for that variation. And linked with the point I was saying about the sort of from a methods point of view, perhaps actually explaining a bit further how you captured the information on what teachers themselves know about, what their own skills are in terms of the tests that their students are taking, because I think we certainly learnt from what you're doing for some of the work that we're doing, so I think that's really helpful. The other question I had that I was asking Caine about earlier, but maybe sort of just to bring it out into the public, was about the extent to which, where the information that you got on the household background of the children came from, because you're talking a lot about their wealth background, and I know that you both have you have the household survey and the in-school survey. To what extent you are able to link the two to get the information on wealth from the households, or whether you're getting it from the children within the schools, and if the latter, how reliable you feel the data are, what some of the challenges might have been, etc. So a question, I guess, sort of about how that was done, because that also relates to a study that we've done, again, using some of the, or building on some of the Young Lives instruments in India and Pakistan. And we tried to both collect data on assets within the households, and then did a subset of those with children in schools to be able to try and, within the same households, to be able to compare what it is that the households were saying, or was being observed within the households in terms of what they had, the structure of the house, etc., and what the children were saying. And we actually found a surprisingly strong correlation on a number of the items, stronger than we might have expected. The things that were weakest was around the actual, what the roof was made of, what the walls were made of. So I guess in the households, the enumerators were observing that. The children might not have understood what they were being asked to say in the same way. So I think there's sort of, again, interesting methodological developments around that, given that the more we're wanting to do this type of work in schools, how do we make sure we do have information on these sorts of the wealth background and other sort of issues that you might otherwise usually collect from the household? Is it possible to get it? My last point, I can't read my own writing, so it's obviously a really important one, but rather than asking it, I'll leave it at that. But as I said at the beginning, I think there's just such a wealth of information that maybe, I'm sure there's many other points in the audience. I don't know if there's any immediate reactions that people want. I can see some hands already going up.